Maybe he wasn't angry at Darren specifically. Maybe he was angry at something else. Some pressure or memory he carried into the courtroom, but that moment passed quickly. He straightened again. Tense as ever. The judge had seen enough. "Security," he said calmly but firmly. "Stand by." Security stepped forward, not to touch anyone, not to restrain anyone, but simply to be present. The officer's eyes widened slightly at their movement. As if he hadn't expected it, Darren stepped slightly aside to give everyone space. Still calm, still respectful. He didn't want the officer to feel cornered. He didn't want the situation to feel hostile. The judge breathed out slowly. "Officer Hale, I am giving you one more opportunity to regain control of yourself." The officer swallowed hard. For the first time, a tiny crack of uncertainty appeared in his expression. He stepped back finally. Heavy silence filled the courtroom again. Darren watched him quietly, not with judgment, but with empathy. He didn't know the officer's story, but he could see something deeper behind the frustration. Something that had nothing to do with a traffic stop. The judge nodded once. "Thank you. Now everyone take a moment. We will continue when order is restored." People exhaled softly, leaning back in their seats, whispering among themselves. Some looked shaken. Some looked relieved. Some looked curious. And deep down, everyone knew the situation was far from over. The courtroom had not erupted yet, but it had tipped dangerously close, and the real turning point was still ahead, the next morning. The courthouse felt different, as if everyone inside already sensed something heavy was going to happen. Word had spread far beyond the town. Reporters showed up early, standing behind metal barriers with microphones in their hands. They whispered to each other, waiting for a moment worth broadcasting. Some had never covered a case like this before, one that had turned from a simple dispute into a national conversation. Inside the building, officers moved around with quiet urgency. It wasn't fear, but a strange kind of tension. It's the kind that forms when people know the truth is getting close, and nobody can hide from it anymore. Even the hallways felt narrower. The wooden benches, usually half empty, were packed with people who came just to witness what they called the turning point. When the former Navy SEAL, who everyone now referred to simply as the man in the blue jacket, entered the hallway, people stood to the side. Nobody said anything. They just watched him walk with a steady pace. He didn't smile, and he didn't look angry. He carried himself like someone who was used to facing storms without flinching. He held a folder in his hand, and the way he gripped it made it clear it mattered. A few steps behind him walked his attorney, a calm older woman with silver streaks in her hair. She didn't speak much, but she kept observing everything around them, as if measuring every person in the hallway. She too sensed that what would happen today was not just another legal moment. It had become something bigger, the officer he had confronted earlier, the one whose decisions started the conflict in the first place, sat alone at one of the benches, bending forward, with both elbows on his knees. His hands were clasped tightly, and his forehead lowered as if he were trying to breathe through something heavy. The man didn't even look up when the SEAL walked past him, but the SEAL noticed him anyway. He paused for a second, not long enough for anyone else to realize it, but long enough for himself. He did not speak. He kept walking. Inside the courtroom, people shifted in their seats, whispering as they waited for the judge to arrive. Some had opinions of their own, some were just curious, and others simply wanted the truth. The journalist with the square glasses, who had been following the case since day one, prepared her notepad again. She had already recorded more details than most reporters. She wasn't chasing drama. She genuinely wanted to understand what had pushed a dedicated service member and a local police officer into a situation that spiraled out of control. The SEAL finally sat at the table beside his attorney. He placed the folder in front of him, adjusting it with careful precision, as if what it held was fragile. The officer sat at the opposite side of the courtroom, glancing in his direction for a moment, then looking away. This time, he didn't seem defensive, just exhausted. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He greeted the courtroom with a respectful nod and settled into his seat. Nobody even breathed loudly. The attorney stood first. She explained that they were ready to present new evidence, something the seal had never shared before, even though it could change everything. The judge raised an eyebrow at that, signaling her to continue. She opened the folder and lifted out a stack of papers. Not the kind that overwhelmed the room, but the kind that matter. The kind that tell a story. She explained that after the confrontation between the officer and the seal, several key details were overlooked, details that now needed to be understood clearly. She began with a calm voice, explaining how the officer had believed he was following proper procedure, how he was dealing with pressure from an unrelated incident earlier that day, and how the seal was returning from a long assignment while still trying to readjust to normal life. She didn't speak to vilify anyone. She spoke to reveal. And that tone shifted the entire energy of the room. The seal then stood up slowly. The judge permitted him to speak. He started by saying he didn't come to court to tear someone down. He said he came because he wanted truth, fairness, and accountability. He admitted that the confrontation affected him deeply, more deeply than anyone had realized, and he had struggled with it in ways nobody saw. He talked about how years of training in difficult environments taught him to remain calm under pressure, but also taught him the importance of respect, both giving it and receiving it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak dramatically. He spoke like someone who had carried a weight for too long and finally set it down. Then he took out a folded sheet of paper from the folder. It looked old and creased, like something he had carried for years. He explained that it was a letter from someone he had served with, someone who had taught him about patience and understanding. He said that during the confrontation with the officer, that letter was in his pocket, and he kept thinking about what it represented, how a single moment can change the direction of someone's life. The courtroom stayed silent. People leaned forward without meaning to, absorbing every word. Next, the officer's representative stood. Instead of trying to argue, he simply nodded to the officer, encouraging him to speak. The officer hesitated but eventually rose. His voice was quieter than anyone expected. He admitted that he handled the situation poorly. He acknowledged that he had been frustrated, tired, and overwhelmed that day. He said none of that excused his behavior, but it did explain how he let his emotions get ahead of his judgment. He explained that he never intended to disrespect the seal nor escalate anything. He just reacted in a way he regretted. And for the first time, he looked directly at the seal. What happened next wasn't dramatic, but it was powerful. The seal didn't glare at him. He didn't turn away. He simply listened. And something in the room shifted again, not tension, but understanding. The judge then asked for clarification on a few points from both sides. The questioning lasted several minutes, but the tone remained calm. It was as if everyone in the courtroom understood they were not here to win or lose. They were here to acknowledge what happened truthfully. When the testimony ended, the judge asked both sides if there was anything more they wished to present. The CAL's attorney paused, glanced at her client, then shook her head. "Nothing further," she said softly. The officer's representative did the same. The judge leaned back in his seat, letting the quiet fill the room. He looked around slowly, not just at the two men involved, but at the people watching, people who had formed opinions without knowing the full story. Finally, the judge began to speak. He said this case reminded him that justice wasn't only about punishment. It was about understanding, responsibility, and making sure something like this never happened again. He said both men had faced pressure in different ways, one from the weight of his duty as a local officer, the other from the lifelong discipline and emotional burden of serving in the military. He explained that while mistakes were made, the willingness to take responsibility mattered just as much as the mistakes themselves. He emphasized that no one in that courtroom was perfect, but each had shown humanity, and that mattered. He then laid out his decision. It wasn't a harsh ruling. It wasn't unfair. It focused on repairing damage instead of creating more. It included accountability for the officer, acknowledgement of the SEAL's experience, and steps to prevent similar situations in the future. He ordered community programs, not punishments. He called for training reforms, better communication, and respectful interactions between law enforcement and citizens. Instead of chaos, the courtroom felt still, People didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply absorbed what they had witnessed, a moment where two people, once locked in conflict, stood on the same ground with a mutual understanding. The SEAL looked down at the paper in his hand. It's the one he had carried for so long. Slowly, he folded it again. The officer glanced toward him, not expecting anything, but the SEAL walked over anyway. He didn't give a speech. He didn't lecture. He simply extended his hand. The officer hesitated, then accepted it. The morning started quietly, the kind of morning where nothing unusual was supposed to happen. The sky over the small city was clear, and the streets looked almost peaceful as people went about their daily routines. Inside the courthouse, it was just another day filled with routine cases. Most people in the building expected a normal schedule: simple hearings, simple arguments, simple outcomes. No one imagined that something surprising was waiting to unfold, something that would leave everyone talking for days. Darren Cole stepped out of his old but well-kept truck and took a slow breath before walking toward the courthouse steps. He did not look like someone who enjoyed being in a place like this. His face was calm, but there was a kind of quiet strength in the way he carried himself. Darren had spent years serving as a Navy SEAL, but very few people knew that. He never talked about it unless someone specifically asked, and even then, he kept his answers short. He was the type of man who believed that actions were more important than stories. He was here because of a minor traffic incident, a citation, that should have been handled in a simple hearing. It wasn't a dramatic situation. At least, that's what he thought when he parked the truck. He believed he would go in, explain what happened, and go home. Nothing more. When he walked through the courthouse doors, he noticed the usual mix of people sitting on benches or standing in line. Some were nervous, some bored, some frustrated. He nodded politely at an older woman who smiled at him. He didn't want to draw attention to himself, so he quietly took a seat near the back, folded his hands, and waited a few minutes later. The door on the side opened, and Officer Brent Hale entered the courtroom. He was in full uniform, walking with sharp, heavy steps that immediately grabbed attention. People didn't know much about him, but his attitude in public had earned him a reputation for being strict, too strict, according to some. He believed in control. He believed in power. He believed that the badge he carried meant something bigger than anyone else in the room. The moment he noticed Darren sitting there, his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened, and his jaw tightened. It was subtle, but not subtle enough to miss. He slowed his steps and stared at Darren for a moment too long, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. Darren felt the stare, but he didn't react. He simply glanced up, nodded once in a respectful way, and looked back down at his hands. Officer Hale muttered something under his breath, but no one close enough could hear what he said. Whatever it wasn't friendly. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. They could feel the tension, even though nothing had happened yet. The judge hadn't arrived. The clerk was still arranging papers. Lawyers were gathered in small groups whispering to clients. Everything looked normal, except for the invisible storm building around Officer Hale and Darren. Darren wasn't a man who invited conflict. After years in the military, he preferred quiet moments and peaceful days. He had seen enough challenges to last a lifetime. A traffic hearing was the last place he expected to feel tension. He hoped the officer's behavior meant nothing, just a passing moment of irritation, maybe even a misunderstanding. But something about the way Officer Hale kept glancing at him made it clear that this wasn't normal. Darren leaned back in the chair and tried to stay relaxed. His goal was simple: attend the hearing, tell the truth, and go home. Nothing more. But as the minutes passed, the room began filling with a kind of silent anticipation. Like everyone could sense that something unusual was approaching. A young man sitting 2 chairs away whispered to his friend, "Why's that officer staring like that?" His friend shrugged. Maybe they know each other. But they didn't. Darren had never seen the officer before the day he received the citation. That day had been strange too. Officer Hale had acted unusually irritated during the stop, as if Darren had personally offended him somehow. Darren had handed over all documents politely, answered every question clearly, and didn't argue about anything. Still, the officer had acted annoyed, almost impatient. Darren had walked away thinking the officer simply had a difficult day. He didn't imagine the officer would carry that attitude into the courtroom. The judge walked in a few minutes later, signaling the start of the session. Everyone stood, then sat again when the judge told them to. The judge began reviewing the list of cases for the morning. The usual routine? Small matters like unpaid parking tickets, minor accidents, paperwork delays. Nothing dramatic. But Officer Hale wasn't focused on any of that. He kept glancing in Darren's direction as if preparing for something. When the judge called Darren's name, the room went quiet. Darren stood, straightened his posture, and walked to the front with a calm, respectful expression. He didn't show nerves. He didn't show frustration. He walked like a man who had practiced patience many times in life. Officer Hale stepped forward too, but with a different energy. His shoulders were squared tightly, his face slightly tense. He stopped just a bit too close to Darren. So close that the judge noticed immediately. "Officer Hale," the judge said, raising a brow, "you may step back slightly. There's enough space for everyone." The officer obeyed, but grudgingly. He stepped back only a few inches. Darren kept his expression steady. The judge reviewed the file briefly. "This seems like a simple issue. Let's go through the events calmly and clearly." Darren nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." But Officer Hale jumped in before Darren could say anything more. "Your Honor," he said loudly, "I need to clarify that the defendant was not cooperating during the stop. He acted evasive and refused to follow instructions." A soft wave of confusion moved through the room. Darren glanced at the officer with a calm expression. He didn't interrupt. The judge looked up slowly. "Officer, we will go one step at a time. Please let me ask the questions." Officer Hale swallowed, his jaw tightening again. "Yes, Your Honor." But his body language showed irritation. His hand rested almost too firmly on his belt, and his eyes never left Darren. The judge turned to Darren. "Sir, please explain in your own words what happened." Darren spoke clearly and respectfully. "Your Honor, I pulled over right away when I saw the lights. I handed over everything the officer requested. I did not argue or refuse anything. I followed every instruction he gave." Paused for a moment, keeping his tone steady and honest. "I did not understand why he seemed upset, but I tried to be respectful the whole time." Before the judge could respond, Officer Hale stepped forward again. "That's not accurate." He hesitated before stopping his vehicle, and he questioned my reasons for pulling him over. Darren blinked slowly but stayed calm. "Your Honor, I did not question him. I only asked if it was safe to pull over on the narrow shoulder. That was all." The judge sighed quietly. "Officer Hale, please refrain from interrupting. I will allow you to speak at the appropriate time." People in the room exchanged looks. The officer's behavior didn't match the seriousness of the case. It was just a traffic citation, not a criminal charge. And yet Officer Hale was acting as if something major was at stake. The judge tried to redirect the conversation. "Let's focus on the facts." But once again, Officer Hale pushed forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this man was trying to manipulate the situation. I could tell he was hiding something." The judge looked up sharply. "Officer Hale, unless you have evidence of that, I suggest you maintain professionalism." The officer clenched his jaw even tighter. He looked frustrated, almost offended that the judge questioned him. Meanwhile, Darren remained calm. His hands were loosely joined in front of him, his posture relaxed, his expression steady. He didn't react, didn't show anger, didn't raise his voice. Years of training had taught him that staying calm was always better than responding with emotion. But the officer's behavior was becoming more difficult to ignore. People in the courtroom were watching closely now. The tension wasn't hidden anymore. It felt like the start of something brewing beneath the surface, something unpredictable. The judge took a deep breath. "All right. We're going to review the incident step by step. Officer Hale, please keep your comments brief and factual." But his expression made it clear he wasn't satisfied. Darren could feel the air in the room changing. He didn't want conflict. He had come here prepared to resolve something small and simple, but it was becoming obvious that the officer had brought something personal into the room, something deeper than a minor traffic issue. The The judge went through the early details, asking both sides questions. Darren answered every question politely. The officer answered every question with a tone that felt too sharp, too defensive. Some people in the back whispered, "Why is the officer acting like this? It's just a ticket. Why so much drama?" Man looks calm. The officer looks stressed. Darren heard the whispers, but didn't react. He simply kept breathing slowly, trying to maintain his patience. He didn't want the situation to grow into something bigger, but sometimes life has a strange way of taking a simple moment and turning it into something unexpected. Sometimes a small spark becomes a flame without warning. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of the day that would become unforgettable. The room felt colder, even though the temperature had not changed. Something about the way Officer Brent Hale stood, stiff and restless, made everyone else sit a little straighter. It wasn't the typical tension of a courtroom. It was something different, something that didn't match the small matter being discussed. Most people had come expecting nothing more than a slow morning, but by now, even those waiting for unrelated cases were watching closely. Whispering quietly to each other, Darren Cole stood with the same quiet posture he had carried since he walked in. His hands rested calmly in front of him, and his voice remained steady each time he was asked a question. He didn't have anything to hide. He simply wanted to explain his side with honesty and leave. Yet the more composed he stayed, the more agitated Officer Hale seemed to become. It didn't make sense to most of the spectators. Usually, officers appeared calm and factual in court, especially with something as small as a traffic matter. But Officer Hale acted almost personally offended, as if the situation were something much larger or more serious than it really was. The judge shuffled through the documents and cleared his throat. "Officer Hale, your notes here say the vehicle slowed before pulling over. That's fairly common on narrow roads." The officer straightened sharply. "Your Honor, that was not a normal hesitation. It was deliberate." He was looking for a place to escape. Soft murmur moved through the room again. Darren's eyebrows barely lifted at the accusation. Escape. The idea seemed unreasonable. The judge set the papers down in a patient but firm manner. "Officer, please remember that speculation is not the same as fact. We will only discuss what you saw, not what you believe might have been happening." Officer Hale pressed his lips together tightly. "Understood, Your Honor, but I know the signs." The judge responded gently but directly. "We are not here to analyze signs. We are here to discuss one traffic citation." Darren lowered his gaze for a moment, not out of guilt, but out of a quiet sadness. He didn't understand why the officer seemed determined to paint him in such an extreme way. Darren was used to pressure in life, used to people assuming things, used to being misunderstood at times. But this situation felt strangely targeted. Still, he kept his calm. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Cole, let's continue with your explanation." Darren nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. As I mentioned earlier, I slowed down because the shoulder was narrow. I didn't want to stop in a place where another car could hit mine or hit the officer. I wasn't trying to do anything unusual, just trying to be safe." His tone was gentle and respectful, not defensive. He explained things the same way someone might explain something to a neighbor or a family member. His voice didn't carry any frustration, even though many others might have lost patience by now. But Officer Hale shook his head quickly. "That is not what happened." He was trying to stall. I could see the way he looked in the mirror. The judge raised a hand. "Officer Hale, he looked like he was calculating something." The officer insisted. This time the judge closed his eyes briefly, clearly running out of patience. "Officer, that is interpretation, not fact. Let's stay grounded." The officer's breathing grew slightly heavier. Someone in the audience whispered, "What is his problem?" Another whispered, "He's acting like this is some kind of crime case." A third person replied softly, "The other guy looks calm. Doesn't seem like someone who would cause trouble." The judge continued asking routine questions, and Darren answered each one the same way, clear, polite, steady. He described the moment he pulled over, how he kept both hands visible, how he spoke to the officer, and how he responded to instructions. There was nothing in his words that sounded defensive or rehearsed. He was simply describing what had happened, moment by moment. But the calmer Darren seemed, the more irritated Officer Hale became at one point. When the judge turned to ask the clerk a question, Officer Hale leaned slightly toward Darren and spoke in a low voice. Almost too quiet to hear. You think you're smarter than everyone here, don't you? Darren didn't flinch. He didn't even fully turn his head. He simply answered in the same calm tone he had used throughout the hearing. I'm just answering questions, sir. The officer's jaw flexed hard, as if he disliked that answer even more. Before anything else could be said, the judge looked up again. All right, let's examine the interaction that followed the vehicle stop. Officer Hale immediately stepped forward, eager to retake control of the narrative. Your Honor, the defendant was uneasy from the start. He avoided eye contact. He spoke slowly as if trying to think of what to say, and he seemed overly cautious. The judge blinked. Overly cautious? Many people become nervous around officers. That's not unusual. But nervous people don't act calculated, the officer insisted again. He was too calm. A few people in the courtroom actually smiled at the contradiction. To calm? A moment ago, the officer claimed Darren was suspicious for being too slow. Now he claimed Darren was suspicious for being too calm. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His tone grew firmer. Officer Hale, the court does not judge people based on your personal impressions of their expressions or levels of calmness. We need actual events, not emotional reactions. Officer Hale opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, but the judge lifted a hand again, signaling him to stop. Darren shifted slightly. Not out of discomfort, but simply to relax his shoulders. Even inside a courtroom, in the middle of an increasingly tense exchange, he carried a sense of quiet discipline that felt very different from anger or frustration. People watching him sensed that he didn't want trouble, not even a little. He wanted clarity, fairness, and respect. Nothing else. The judge turned back to Darren. Did you refuse any instructions? No, Your Honor, Darren replied. I followed everything I was told to do, and I tried to stay calm because I didn't want the situation to feel tense. I've learned that staying calm helps everyone think clearly. Officer Hale interrupted again. That's exactly what someone would say if they were hiding something. The judge snapped his attention toward the officer. Officer Hale, this is your final warning. If you continue interrupting, I will ask you to wait outside until I call you back in. A long, heavy silence filled the room. The officer clenched his hands behind his back, trying to appear composed. Yes, Your Honor. The tension didn't leave, though. It simply settled into the air like something invisible but strong enough to feel. The judge asked a few more questions about the paperwork and timings. Darren answered everything in the same steady manner, without any change in tone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't attempt to make the officer look bad. He didn't add unnecessary details. He simply told the truth with a clear mind and plain words. Yet each time he spoke, Officer Hale rolled his shoulders, shifting restlessly as if the calmness itself bothered him. Finally, the judge asked, Mr. Cole, do you have anything else to add? Darren thought for a moment. Only that I respect the officer's job, Your Honor. I know it's not easy. I just want the facts to be clear. That's all. His sincerity hung in the air. Every person in the room could feel it. The judge nodded slowly, appreciating the tone. Before he could respond, however, Officer Hale stepped forward again. With all due respect, the officer began, this man is putting on an act. I know when someone is trying to manipulate a situation. And the judge cut him off sharply. Officer Hale, step back. The room froze. The officer didn't move. The judge's voice hardened. Now, Officer Hale hesitated, making the room even more anxious. Then he finally stepped back half a pace, not as fully as he should have, but enough to avoid being in immediate violation of the judge's order. The judge exhaled slowly. This is a court of law, not a place for assumptions or personal emotions. If you have evidence or details related to the event, state them. If not, remain silent until I ask for your input. The officer's shoulders rose and fell with a barely controlled breath. Understood, but his eyes never left Darren. Darren felt the stare, but stayed patient. A few people in the back began to whisper again. One whispered, "He's losing control." Another added, "This is going to blow up if he keeps pushing." But Darren didn't look tense. He looked thoughtful, almost as if he felt sorry for the officer's frustration. He didn't want this situation to escalate or embarrass anyone. He simply wanted fairness. The judge tried to shift the atmosphere by moving to the next detail, asking about the recorded timestamp on the citation. As he examined it, he asked the clerk to look something up. Meanwhile, Darren and Officer Hale remained standing near each other at the front of the room. The silence between them grew heavier. Finally, Darren spoke softly, almost politely. "Officer, I don't want any misunderstanding between us. If there's something I said that offended you earlier that day, I apologize." The officer's head snapped slightly toward him, his expression unreadable at first. "You think this is about being offended?" he asked in a low voice. "I don't know," Darren replied. "But I don't want tension. That's all." For a brief second, it seemed like the officer might soften, but then he straightened even more stiffly. "You can fool others with that calm tone," he muttered, "but you won't fool me." Darren felt a brief sadness again, not fear. Not anger, just sadness that the officer's mind had already formed a conclusion he could not change. The judge called their attention again. "All right, I've reviewed the details. Officer Hale, I will give you a moment to provide any final factual statements about the event." This was the moment where most officers simply summarized their notes. But instead, Officer Hale took a step forward to close again and spoke louder than necessary. "Yes, Your Honor. My final statement is that this man acted suspicious from the start, and I believe he was trying to hide something during that stop." The judge shut the file slowly. "And do you have any evidence to support that?" The room held its breath. Officer Hale opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He hesitated. The judge waited. Still nothing. Finally, the officer exhaled sharply. "Not physical evidence." "But then it does not belong in this courtroom," the judge said firmly. The officer's face tightened even more. The judge set the papers aside. "Mr. Cole, thank you for your patience. I've heard what I needed to hear for now." Darren nodded respectfully. But as the judge prepared to move to the next step, the officer suddenly shifted forward again, his expression pushing past professionalism into something more heated, and that was when the atmosphere in the room changed once more, this time more sharply, more visibly. As if everyone could feel that things were drifting toward a moment no one expected. The courtroom wasn't chaotic yet, but it was close, very close. The moment the judge closed the file, the room felt strangely still, like the quiet just before a storm. No one moved, no one coughed, no one rustled papers. It was as if everyone sensed that something was shifting, something small but important. Even the air felt heavier. Darren stood there calmly, waiting for the judge's next instruction. His posture didn't change. His breathing stayed steady. He had been through far more stressful moments in life, moments that demanded focus and patience. To him, this was simply a tense courtroom, nothing more. But to Officer Brent Hale, it was turning into something he clearly couldn't control. The judge cleared his throat and began to speak. "Given the information provided, I see no reason for this level of but." Before he could finish, the officer stepped forward so sharply that several people gasped. "Your Honor," he said loudly, almost too loudly for the small room, "I need to make it clear that this man has been downplaying his behavior. I could feel something was wrong during the stop. I could feel it." The judge blinked slowly. "Officer Hale, we are dealing with facts, not feelings." But the officer didn't step back. He took another small step toward Darren, so close the judge noticed instantly. "Officer," the judge said firmly, "I already instructed you to give space." The officer didn't move. Darren gently shifted a half step backward, not because he felt threatened, but because he respected personal space and didn't want to add tension. His tone was calm when he spoke. "Sir, I'm just standing here. I'm not trying to make this difficult." The officer didn't seem to hear him. Or maybe he did, and he didn't like the calmness in Darren's voice. Something about that steady tone had bothered the officer from the start. Perhaps he felt challenged by how composed Darren was. Perhaps he misunderstood confidence for attitude. Whatever the reason, the officer's expression kept tightening, his eyebrows pulling together as if fighting an invisible frustration. A woman sitting in the third row whispered softly, "Is he so close to him?" Someone next to her answered, "It's like he's trying to start something." But Darren didn't react. His face stayed neutral, kept his hands where everyone could see them. He didn't raise his voice, didn't change his expression. Still, something about his calmness seemed to irritate the officer even more. The judge leaned forward. "Officer Hale, please step to your designated position." Again, he didn't move. The judge repeated himself with slightly more force. "Officer Hale, step back." This time the officer exhaled through his nose. A slow, tense breath. But instead of stepping back, he turned toward Darren and pointed not aggressively, but sharply enough for people to notice. "You're not being honest," he said. "You're hiding something. I know when someone is pretending." Darren looked at him with steady eyes. "Sir, I'm not pretending anything. I'm answering the questions the judge asks." The officer took another step forward, closing whatever space Darren had created by moving earlier. Several people straightened up in their seats. Court security, who had been standing near the back of the room, slowly leaned in with more attention. They didn't move yet, but their eyes stayed alert. The judge's voice sharpened. "Officer Hale, you are close to being out of order. Maintain distance or I will stop this hearing immediately." But the officer didn't step back. Instead, he spoke again, still pointing at Darren. "He's acting like this because he thinks he can get away with it." Darren shook his head gently. "I'm not trying to get away with anything. I'm here to clear up a misunderstanding." The officer's voice grew louder. "That's what they always say." It was the first moment in the entire hearing where Darren felt a small tug in his chest, something close to sadness, maybe even disappointment. He understood pressure. He understood stress. But he didn't understand why this officer was so determined to cast him as someone he wasn't. Still, he stayed calm. "Sir, I respect your job, truly, but I haven't lied. Not once." That sentence made something tighten in the officer's jaw. His shoulders stiffened, and he took another step forward. This time, the judge slammed the gavel. "Enough, Officer Hale, that is an order. Step back now." The loud crack startled nearly everyone in the room. The officer flinched a little, but instead of stepping back immediately, he looked at the judge, then at Darren, as if deciding what to do. Something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of confusion and stubbornness. Finally, he stepped back, but only a single step, barely enough to respect the judge's order. The judge exhaled slowly. "We will take a short pause. This is not the environment for a fair hearing right now." He looked at Darren. "Mr. Cole, please step aside for a moment while I address something." Darren nodded respectfully and moved to the side. But before the judge could continue, Officer Hale suddenly stepped forward again, this time not as sharply, but with enough urgency to make the room tense once more. "Your Honor," he said, trying to sound composed but failing to hide the strain in his voice, "I need to express a concern." The judge looked tired. "Go ahead." The officer pointed again, but this time he kept his arm lower. "This man keeps acting calm on purpose. People like him, they plan things. They think they can outsmart everyone by staying quiet." The judge blinked. "Officer Hale, calmness is not a crime." But the officer shook his head. "Not a crime, but it's a sign." The judge stared at him for a moment, then said, "A sign of what?" The officer hesitated, searching for words. "A sign that he's hiding something." The judge sighed. "You've made that assumption several times today, without facts." "But it's true," the officer insisted. "I can feel it." The judge leaned back. "Feelings are not evidence." By now, nearly everyone in the courtroom was watching closely. Some people felt confused. Others felt uneasy. Even those who didn't understand legal procedures could tell the officer's behavior didn't match what was expected of him. Meanwhile, Darren simply stood there, calm as before, but with a slight crease in his brow, not anger, just quiet concern. He didn't want this to turn into something unpleasant. He didn't want the officer to get in trouble. He didn't want the courtroom to feel unsafe. He just wanted fairness. The judge looked down at the documents again. "We will resolve this with clarity and professionalism, but he didn't finish his sentence. Because suddenly, Officer Hale stepped forward again closer, faster, more abruptly than before. The room gasped. He wasn't doing anything physical or hostile, but his movement was so sudden and intense that people instinctively reacted. A few stood from their seats. A woman covered her mouth. Court security took a single step forward, ready but not engaging. And Darren? He didn't move, not even a bit. He simply stood there, calm as ever, like someone who had learned long ago how to respond to sudden pressure without flinching. Officer Hale stopped barely a foot away from him. "Look at me," the officer said. Darren lifted his eyes gently. "I am looking at you." The officer's voice dropped lower, so low only the front few rows could hear clearly. "Tell the truth." "I already have," Darren said softly. The officer leaned in slightly too close for a courtroom. "No, you think you can stand there and act calm and pretend you're harmless? But I know better." A strange silence wrapped around the room. Everyone held their breath. Darren spoke again, his tone unchanged. "I'm not pretending." But the officer's breathing grew unsteady. His eyes flickered between Darren's face and the floor, as if he was fighting some internal confusion he couldn't control. The judge slammed the gavel again. "Officer Hale, step back immediately." This time he didn't step back right away. He just stood there, frozen between defiance and hesitation. Darren took a slow breath. Not a dramatic one, not a scared one, just a steady breath someone might take before speaking gently. "Sir," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this. I'm not your enemy." The officer blinked rapidly, almost surprised by the softness in Darren's voice. For a brief moment, just a flicker, something in the officer's expression wavered. A mixture of stress, frustration, and confusion passed across his face. Maybe he didn't even understand why he felt so defensive. And that single gesture softened the air in the entire room. The journalists didn't rush forward. They didn't shout questions. They captured the moment quietly, knowing the significance didn't come from drama, but from human dignity. As people began to leave, the SEAL stepped outside into the sunlight for the first time that day. Reporters swarmed near the barriers, shouting questions, but he didn't respond. His attorney cleared a path, guiding him through the crowd. And for a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, not victory. Not defeat, but clarity. And yet, even with everything that had happened, one thing remained uncertain. The biggest surprise, the unthinkable result. Everyone kept whispering about was still coming, and nobody in that courthouse had any idea what awaited them next. When the SEAL stepped out of the courthouse, he thought everything was finally over. The sun felt warm on his face, and for a moment, he let himself breathe freely. The crowd outside had grown bigger than the day before. Some people clapped as he walked down the steps. Others simply watched with quiet respect. He didn't wave or smile. He just nodded politely and continued walking. But what he didn't know was that the real twist the thing people would talk about for years was waiting, just a short distance away as he reached the parking area. A man in a dark suit approached him. He wasn't from the press, and he didn't carry a microphone or camera. He moved with purpose, but not aggressively. The attorney stepped slightly forward, ready to intervene if needed. The man held up a badge, though it wasn't a police badge. It had a different emblem, one the SEAL recognized instantly. It belonged to a federal department connected to military affairs. The SEAL stopped walking. The man gently asked if they could talk in private. Not in a forceful way, but with a tone that said this was important. The attorney looked at her client, waiting for his signal. After a moment, he nodded. They followed the man to a quieter corner of the parking area. Away from the crowd, the man introduced himself and explained that he hadn't come as part of an investigation. He wasn't there because of the confrontation, the court case, or any trouble. Instead, he explained that during the hearing, someone high up had been watching the case. Not just watching it, had caught their attention in a way no one expected. He said the way the SEAL carried himself, even under pressure, even with the whole town watching, showed a level of discipline and emotional strength that reminded people why he had been respected during his service. It wasn't just his military background. It was the way he handled conflict, listened, and maintained calm when others couldn't. The SEAL listened quietly, unsure where this was going. The man explained that a special program, a federal outreach initiative designed to help veterans transition into leadership roles, had been searching for someone who not only understood discipline, but also understood people. Someone who could stay level-headed in the middle of chaos. Someone who didn't act out of ego or anger, but out of principle, and they believed the SEAL was that person. The SEAL was so surprised he didn't speak at first. He expected the courthouse chapter to simply end. He wanted to go home, breathe fresh air, and try to rebuild his routine. He never imagined that something good, something meaningful, could rise from such a difficult situation. The man in the suit handed him an envelope. Inside were details of the program, contact numbers, and a letter official and signed. It invited him to join as a consultant to help train both law enforcement and community organizations on crisis communication, emotional control, and respectful interactions. The program was national. It wasn't small. It wasn't symbolic. It was real. The SEAL looked up from the envelope. Still unsure if he had heard everything correctly, the man continued, saying that people like him, people who had experienced both discipline from the military and the frustrations of civilian misunderstandings, were rare, and his willingness to handle the case with maturity instead of revenge had not gone unnoticed. The country needed people like him in leadership roles, the man said. People who led by example instead of force. The SEAL didn't respond immediately. He thought about the long years he had spent overseas, the things he had learned, the moments he wished he could forget, and the moments he wished he could explain to others, but never found the words. He also thought about the officer he had just shaken hands with in the courtroom. A handshake that almost nobody expected. He asked the man why the department wanted him specifically. When there were thousands of veterans with strong records, the man answered simply, "Because you turn conflict into understanding. Most people can't do that." The SEAL lowered his gaze, feeling both humbled and uncertain. The attorney watched him quietly, leaving him space to process. Finally, the SEAL agreed to think about it. The man smiled politely, thanked him for his time, and walked away without any pressure, leaving the invitation behind. But the moment the federal representative left, something else happened, something nobody expected. The officer from the Confrontations stepped out from the courthouse doors and approached. He seemed hesitant, but determined. His shoulders were straighter, and his expression wasn't tense like earlier. Instead, he seemed grateful. He apologized again, not because the judge asked him to, but because he wanted to. He said that listening to the SEAL speak in court changed how he viewed the confrontation. He admitted he had been carrying frustration for months, and that he unfairly released it on the wrong person. He said the SEAL's calm reaction that day had stayed in his mind ever since. Then, the officer said something even more surprising. He told the SEAL that the department had started reviewing its community training programs because of this case. Not only that, he had volunteered to be part of the reform. He said he wanted to help fix the issues instead of ignoring them. The SEAL was taken aback. This wasn't something he expected to hear. The officer wasn't trying to defend himself anymore. He was trying to rebuild. And it was clear he meant every word. For the first time since the confrontation, the SEAL felt the tension between them fade completely. Not because of legal rulings or pressure, because of honesty. The officer even mentioned that if the CIL accepted the federal invitation, he hoped they might cross paths again, not as opponents, but as partners trying to improve the system. That simple statement carried more warmth than anything said before. The SEAL didn't promise anything, but he nodded, letting the officer know he appreciated the gesture. As the officer walked away, the SEAL's attorney turned to him and smiled softly, telling him she had never seen a case end with this level of sincerity on both sides. She reminded him that not all outcomes are about punishment. Some are about repair. The SEAL stood silently for a long moment. He looked at the courthouse, then at the envelope in his hand. Everything felt different now. Not heavier, just clearer. On the drive home, he opened the envelope again. The letter outlined how his new role could help change the way veterans and civilians understood each other. It talked about bridging gaps, creating communication channels, helping officers avoid situations like the one he had been involved in. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to heal something much bigger, but what touched him the most was one small handwritten line at the bottom of the letter. It simply read, "You handled yourself with honor during a difficult moment. We need more of that." He read that line twice. When he reached home, he sat on his porch for a long time, listening to the wind and feeling the quiet around him. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was carrying something he couldn't explain. He felt lighter. He thought about calling a few old teammates, but he hesitated. Instead, he closed his eyes and tried to picture what life would look like if he accepted the offer. He imagined standing in front of a room full of officers, sharing lessons from his experience, not from a place of superiority, but from a place of understanding. He imagined helping young recruits avoid the mistakes that lead to unnecessary conflicts. He imagined teaching them how to read emotions, how to communicate calmly, and how to show respect even in stressful moments. Then he imagined helping veterans return home with more support, more guidance, and more chances to use their skills for positive change. These thoughts settled comfortably in his mind, but what he didn't know was that someone had filmed the moment he shook hands with the officer in the courtroom. The clip was short, just a few seconds, but it spread fast. People online began sharing it with comments like, "This is how real leadership looks, and this is what respect means." By the evening, the video had millions of views. The SEAL wasn't a person who chased attention, so he didn't even know it was trending. But his phone suddenly began buzzing with messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. Some congratulated him, some thanked him, some told him how moved they were by the gesture. He didn't reply to most of them, but he read every message quietly later that night. He stood in his kitchen, still unsure of what to do next. The envelope sat on the counter. He glanced at it repeatedly. Every time, the possibility of a new direction crept a little closer. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed the number listed in the letter. He didn't give a long speech. He simply said he was ready to accept the invitation. The person on the other end responded warmly, saying they were glad to hear it and that they believed he could make a real difference. They would send him the schedule and details the next morning. When he hung up the phone, he let out a deep breath. Not a sigh, something closer to relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt purpose returning to him. Not the kind that comes from orders or missions, but the kind that comes from helping others avoid the pain he had lived through in the weeks that followed. He traveled to different cities, speaking with officers, community groups, and young cadets. People listened to him not because of his title, but because of the authenticity in his voice. He wasn't perfect, but he was honest. And that mattered even more. The officer he confronted even joined one of the sessions, sitting humbly in the back of the room. The SEAL noticed him, but didn't call attention to it. After the training ended, the officer thanked him quietly for the lessons. And so, what began as a public conflict, what began with tension, misunderstanding, and frustration, transformed into something nobody predicted. Not chaos, not bitterness, but change. A change that helped officers handle pressure better. A change that helped veterans rejoin society with dignity. Change that supported communication, respect, and understanding. The unthinkable result wasn't a dramatic event. It was the way to people who once stood on opposite sides became part of the same effort to build something better. And the SEAL, who once walked into the courthouse unsure of his future, walked out with a new mission, one that didn't require force, but heart. The conflict had ended, but the story of what came after, that was only just beginning.